Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that moved more slowly than ours ever does. A world where the day was not broken into notifications, glowing screens, or artificial light, but stretched gently from sunrise to sunset, guided only by habit, weather, and human patience. This is not a story about great inventions or sudden change. It's about the long, ordinary hours before electricity quietly rewired how time itself felt, before switches, before sockets, before light could be summoned on command. People had to fill entire days with effort, waiting, repetition, and silence. Every task took longer. Every pause mattered. And when darkness arrived, it truly arrived, bringing an end to work, conversation, and often thought itself. Tonight, we'll explore what people actually did all day before electricity shaped modern life, not through drama, but through routine. As you settle in, notice how different this pace feels. If you're someone who struggles to slow your thoughts at night, if modern life feels too loud even when the room is quiet, this story may feel strangely familiar. And if calm, unhurried history like this genuinely helps you rest, you might consider subscribing, not because you should, but because you deserve content that doesn't demand anything from you. Now, let the day begin, slowly. In the world before electricity, the day did not begin because someone decided it should. It began because light returned. Morning was not an alarm, not a schedule, not a notification vibrating on a table. It was a gradual awareness, felt first through temperature, then through sound, and finally through the slow change in darkness. People woke as the room softened, as shadows lost their edges, and as the quiet of night loosened its grip. There was no sharp dividing line between sleep and waking, only a gentle transition that most bodies learned without instruction. Homes were dark for much of the early morning. Windows were small, often heavy with soot or frost, and glass itself was imperfect. Light crept in unevenly, touching one corner of a room while leaving another untouched. People stirred, not because they were fully rested, but because the world outside had begun again. Farmers rose earliest, followed by laborers, shopkeepers, servants, and finally those whose work depended more on trade than daylight. Time was shared, not owned. One rose because others did. The first actions of the day were quiet and practical. There was no sense of urgency, but there was no leisure either. Fires had to be coaxed back to life from embers saved the night before. This alone could take time, patience, and skill. A poorly tended hearth meant cold food, cold hands, and wasted hours. Before anything else could happen, warmth had to be created. The crackle of wood, the smell of smoke, and the careful positioning of fuel were the real beginnings of the day. Water was fetched or prepared next. In cities, it might come from a shared pump or well. In rural areas, from a stream or rain barrel. It was carried by hand, often several times, because water was used carefully. Washing one's face was brief and functional. Bathing was not a morning ritual, but an occasional necessity. Cleanliness existed, but it did not resemble modern expectations. Bodies were managed, not polished. Breakfast was simple, repetitive, and rarely eaten in silence. Porridge, bread, leftovers from the night before, or whatever could be warmed quickly became fuel rather than pleasure. Meals did not signal comfort, they signaled preparation. Children ate quickly, adults without ceremony. There were no glowing kitchens, no hum of machines, No radio voices filling the air, only the sound of chewing, of chairs scraping floors, and of the fire breathing steadily. As daylight strengthened, people oriented themselves to it, almost unconsciously. Windows mattered. Doors were opened, not for air alone, but for light. Tasks were positioned near brightness. Sewing tables, workbenches, wash basins, and desks migrated toward windows as the sun climbed. Shadows determined productivity. When light was strong, fine work was done. When it faded, only rough tasks remained possible. Work itself filled most of the day, but not in the compressed, optimized way we imagine now. Without electricity, even simple actions expanded. Writing required ink preparation. Cooking required constant attention. Cleaning required physical effort without mechanical help. Every task had weight. Fatigue arrived, slowly but steadily, spreading through the body like a known companion. People did not talk about being tired. They expected it. Outside, streets and yards slowly came alive. Horses, carts, footsteps, and voices replaced the stillness of night. Shops opened when visibility allowed. Tradesmen worked by windows or open doors. Factories, where they existed, relied on daylight and steam rather than endless illumination. When clouds passed overhead, productivity dipped. Nature controlled the tempo, and no one argued with it. Children were absorbed into this rhythm early. They did not have separate worlds of play and work for long. Even when young, they carried water, gathered fuel, watched siblings, or ran errands. Their days were long, their distractions few. Boredom existed, but it was not named. It was simply endured, like hunger or cold, as part of being awake. There was also waiting, a form of activity modern life has almost erased. Waiting for bread to bake, for clothes to dry, for light to improve, for someone to arrive on foot. These pauses were not filled with entertainment. They were filled with observation, with small talk, or with nothing at all. Minds wandered because they had room to thoughts, stretched because there was time for them to do so. As the morning moved toward midday, the sense of the day settled in. There was no illusion that time could be saved or borrowed. If something was not finished before light shifted, it would wait. This knowledge shaped behavior. People planned around daylight instinctively. They conserved energy because it could not be replenished easily. They accepted limits because those limits were visible, written in shadow and sun. This was how days began before electricity. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily. Life did not rush forward. It unfolded, one task after another, held together by habit and necessity. And for those living within it, this pace was not slow. It was simply normal. By the time the morning work had settled into rhythm, the day revealed its true weight. Before electricity, the middle hours were not something to get through quickly. They were something to endure. Once the essential tasks of waking, warming, and preparing were complete, people faced the long stretch of daylight that had to be filled carefully, deliberately, and without waste. There was no sense that time could be shortened. Noon did not rush toward evening, it expanded. Work during these hours was shaped almost entirely by visibility and stamina. Tasks were chosen not for convenience, but for practicality. Fine work was saved for when light was strongest. Reading, writing, sewing, and repair happened close to windows, often with bodies angled to catch every possible ray. When clouds passed overhead, hands slowed, eyes strained. People paused, waiting for brightness to return before continuing. Even the sky dictated productivity. For many, labor was physical and repetitive. Washing clothes meant hauling water, heating it slowly, scrubbing fabric by hand, wringing it out, and hanging it where sun and air might dry it before nightfall. Cooking required constant presence. Pots could not be left unattended. Fires had to be fed, adjusted, and watched. A moment of distraction could ruin a meal or waste fuel. Attention was continuous, but never frantic. Those who worked outside the home experienced the same slowness differently. Shops opened fully only when light allowed customers to see goods clearly. Tradesmen measured their output against the sun, knowing that cloudy days meant less work completed. In factories that relied on daylight or steam, hours were long, but not endlessly productive. Darkness always waited at the edges of the schedule, reminding everyone that work had a natural limit. Meals in the middle of the day were not breaks in the modern sense. They were pauses meant to sustain the body rather than refresh the mind. Food was eaten where one stood or sat, often quickly, often without conversation. There was little sense of reward. Eating was maintenance. Once finished, work resumed without ceremony. What modern life might call boredom was simply part of existence. Without electric entertainment, the mind wandered during repetitive tasks. Thoughts drifted, circled, and returned. People replayed worries, remembered past events, or imagined futures that might never arrive. Silence was not unusual. It was expected. And within that silence, time felt thick, almost tangible. Children, too, lived inside these long hours. Schooling, where it existed, followed daylight. When lessons ended, children were folded back into household labor, fetching, carrying, watching, mending. Play happened in fragments, squeezed between responsibilities. There were no screens to disappear into, no constant novelty. Days felt long because they were. Waiting remained a central feature of life. Waiting for deliveries that arrived on foot or by horse. Waiting for repairs that took days instead of minutes. Waiting for letters that might take weeks to reach their destination. This waiting was not restless. It was accepted as part of how the world functioned. People adjusted expectations downward, aligning them with reality. As afternoon progressed, fatigue became more noticeable. Bodies ached, hands stiffened, and concentration faded. Yet stopping entirely was rare. Rest meant shifting to lighter tasks rather than ceasing activity. Sorting, mending, organizing, or simply sitting near a window, observing the street. Stillness was allowed, but idleness carried quiet judgment. Everyone was expected to be doing something, even if that something was small. The soundscape of these hours was muted but constant. Footsteps, distant conversation, animals, wind, tools against wood or metal. There was no hum of electricity, no background noise filling every gap. Sounds came and went, leaving stretches of quiet behind them. In these gaps, awareness sharpened. People noticed small changes, the angle of light, the shift in air, the approach of evening long before it arrived. As shadows lengthened, urgency returned gently. Tasks unfinished would soon become impossible. Light was a resource that could not be stored. People hurried, not because they were pressured, but because darkness was predictable. This knowledge shaped the final hours of work, lending them focus without panic. The middle of the day before electricity was not dramatic, but it was demanding. It required patience, endurance, and acceptance. Time did not bend to human will. Humans bent to time, and in doing so, They learned to live within its limits, filling long hours with effort, waiting, and quiet thought until evening slowly began to claim the light. As the afternoon leaned quietly toward evening, life before electricity entered its most delicate phase. This was the part of the day people felt most strongly, even if they rarely spoke about it. Light, which had guided every action since morning, now began to thin. It did not disappear suddenly, it weakened. And with that weakening came a subtle shift in mood, posture, and thought. People noticed the change first in their eyes. Reading became uncomfortable. Fine stitching required pauses. Writing slowed as letters grew less precise. Shadows lengthened across floors and walls, stretching objects into unfamiliar shapes. A room that felt usable an hour earlier now seemed hesitant, as though it were slowly withdrawing permission to be occupied. This was when decisions had to be made. Tasks were evaluated not by importance, but by possibility. What could still be finished before darkness fully arrived? What could wait until tomorrow? What must be abandoned altogether? There was no frustration in this process, only calculation. People were accustomed to limits, and light was one of the strictest. Windows became gathering points again. Chairs were repositioned, tables nudged closer. Entire households subtly rearranged themselves to follow the retreating sun. This movement happened without instruction, guided by long familiarity. Even children understood it instinctively. When the light moved, so did everyone else. Outside, the world also began to contract. Streets grew quieter as work concluded. Shops closed, not by schedule, but by visibility. Doors were shut earlier on cloudy days. Later in summer, the pace of movement slowed. Footsteps became less frequent. Animals were led back indoors. The day folded in on itself. For many, this was the hour when fatigue became unavoidable. Bodies that had been working since early morning now carried the full weight of the day. Muscles ached, hands felt heavy, and attention wandered. Yet rest was still delayed. Evening tasks remained: food preparation, tidying, securing the home against night. Cooking during these hours required care. Without strong light, mistakes were easy. Fires had to be managed more closely. Ingredients were measured by habit rather than sight. Smell, sound, and touch replaced vision. People leaned closer to pots, listened for changes, adjusted by instinct. Cooking was slower, more cautious, and deeply physical. Conversation, when it occurred, softened. Voices lowered. Words were fewer. The day's energy had been spent, leaving behind a quiet residue. Stories were repeated, comments brief. Silence filled the spaces between. No one rushed to fill it. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was familiar. Children who had been active earlier now grew restless or subdued. Without artificial light, play narrowed. Games required visibility, and imagination had limits when bodies were tired. Children lingered near adults, observing, waiting, sometimes drifting into stillness long before bedtime. Night shaped behavior long before it arrived. Waiting returned once more, but now with a different texture. People waited for food to finish cooking, for darkness to fully settle, for the day to officially end. This waiting was heavier than earlier pauses. It carried fatigue, hunger, and a faint sense of relief. The most demanding hours were over. What remained was endurance. As light faded further, tasks became broader and less precise. Sorting, stacking, cleaning surfaces by touch rather than sight. Objects were returned to familiar places so they could be found again in the morning. Order mattered more now, because disorder was harder to correct in darkness. Candles and oil lamps were prepared carefully, but not lit without reason. Artificial light was precious. Fuel cost money and effort. Light was used sparingly, deliberately. It extended the day slightly, but never restored it. Even with a flame burning, darkness remained present at the edges of the room. Emotionally, these hours carried a quiet gravity. The day had been lived. What was done could not be undone. Tomorrow would come, but not yet. People sat with this feeling nightly, a subtle awareness of time passing, of effort spent, of another day added to a life measured in routine rather than milestones. This was the moment when the world before electricity felt most distant from ours, not because of hardship, but because of acceptance. People did not fight the fading light. They moved with it. They allowed the day to close, slowly, predictably, and without resistance. Evening before electricity was not entertainment, it was transition, a narrowing of possibility, a gentle compression of life into smaller, quieter spaces. And as darkness finally settled, it brought with it not fear, but familiarity, the understood signal that it was time to stop. When darkness finally settled in, life before electricity did not continue as it had during the day. It contracted. Rooms that once felt usable became smaller, defined by the reach of flame rather than walls. Corners disappeared first. Ceilings faded. The world reduced itself to whatever could be seen, heard, or touched within a narrow circle of light. Candlelight was not bright. It did not fill a room. It hovered, flickered, and retreated at the slightest movement. Shadows moved constantly, reshaping familiar objects into something less certain. Faces looked different by firelight, softer, older, sometimes harder to read. People learned not to rely fully on their eyes. Vision was only one sense among many. Lighting a candle or oil lamp was a decision, not a reflex. Each flame represented cost, effort, and future scarcity. Wicks had to be trimmed. Oil had to be conserved. Candles burned unevenly and unpredictably. People waited until darkness was complete before lighting them, stretching the last usable moments of twilight as far as possible. Once lit, light dictated behavior. Activities gathered tightly around it. Tables were pulled closer. Chairs angled inward. Hands hovered near the flame to see their work clearly. Anything requiring detail demanded stillness. Sudden movement risked knocking over a lamp or extinguishing the flame entirely. Evening tasks were chosen carefully. Reading, if done at all, was slow and tiring. Eyes strained quickly. Words blurred. Pages were turned deliberately to avoid shadow. Many preferred listening to reading aloud, conserving both light and vision. Sewing and mending continued, but only for short periods. Mistakes were costly in poor light. Conversation changed under candlelight. Voices dropped naturally. Words slowed. People spoke when necessary, not continuously. Silence settled easily between sentences, broken only by the soft sounds of flame, fabric, or breathing. There was no background noise to compete with thought. Every sound carried weight. Children were quieter now. Without bright light, their energy had nowhere to go. They sat close to adults, sometimes drowsy, sometimes restless, but rarely stimulated. Stories were told softly, often repeated night after night. Familiarity mattered more than novelty. New tales demanded attention that tired minds could not give. Homes felt older at night. Objects revealed their wear more clearly. Scratches, stains, and repairs caught the eye in uneven light. People were constantly reminded of use, age, and decay. There was no illusion of perfection. Everything bore marks of time. Time itself behaved differently. Without clocks illuminated or glowing reminders of the hour, evening passed ambiguously. People estimated rather than measured. The body knew when it was time to rest long before the mind did. Fatigue spoke clearly. There was no incentive to ignore it. Entertainment, as we understand it now, barely existed. Music might be played quietly if instruments were available and light sufficient. More often, people sat together without doing anything identifiable. They rested without naming it. Minds drifted. Thoughts repeated. The day replayed itself in fragments. Privacy was limited, but solitude still existed. One could sit silently among others and remain inward. Darkness allowed for this. Faces were less readable, expressions less visible. People withdrew without leaving. Outside, the world had nearly vanished. Streets were dangerous and uninviting after dark. Only necessary travel occurred. Night belonged to stillness. Windows glowed faintly, marking where life continued quietly behind walls. Beyond that, there was very little. As candles burned lower, urgency returned briefly. Tasks were finished hastily. Lamps were extinguished one by one. Darkness reclaimed the space gradually, decisively. The day was ending whether one felt ready or not. Preparing for sleep was simple but deliberate. Clothing was folded for reuse. Shoes were placed carefully to be found again in the morning. Fires were banked, not extinguished completely. The home was secured against cold and intrusion. Beds were not places of comfort alone. They were places of necessity. Sleep arrived quickly for most, pulled forward by exhaustion rather than choice. There was little temptation to stay awake. Darkness offered no distraction. Lying in bed, people listened to wind, to distant sounds, to the settling of wood and stone. Night was not filled with artificial reassurance. It was vast, quiet, and unavoidable. This was evening before electricity, not a continuation of the day, but a narrowing of life into essentials. Light had retreated, energy had faded. What remained was rest, silence, and the certainty that tomorrow would begin the same way when light returned again. Sleep before electricity was not a single event. It was a long process that began well before anyone lay down. The body prepared itself slowly, guided less by intention and more by exhaustion. By the time darkness had fully settled, most people were already moving toward rest without naming it. Wakefulness lost its purpose once light and energy were gone. Bedrooms were not private sanctuaries. They were functional spaces, often shared, sometimes crowded, and rarely quiet. Beds were placed where space allowed, not where comfort demanded. In many homes, several people slept in the same room, and in poorer households, in the same bed. Sleep was communal, negotiated, and deeply physical. Beds themselves were simple and imperfect. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers, depending on means. They shifted over time, becoming uneven and lumpy. Sheets were reused, aired rather than washed frequently. Blankets were heavy, sometimes coarse, but essential. Cold was a constant companion, especially in winter. People slept dressed, layered, prepared to wake cold. Getting into bed was not the end of activity. Bodies needed time to settle. Muscles ached from the day's labor. Joints protested as stillness replaced movement. People adjusted positions repeatedly, seeking relief rather than comfort. Sleep arrived not as escape, but as surrender. Darkness inside the room was complete. Candles were rarely left burning. Firelight from a banked hearth provided minimal glow, if any. Once eyes adjusted, shapes dissolved. The world narrowed to sound, breath, and sensation. The mind, suddenly free of tasks, often became restless. Sleep was lighter than we expect today. People woke frequently. Sounds carried easily in the quiet night. Footsteps outside, animals, wind, distant voices. The house itself spoke, creaking, settling, shifting with temperature. These noises were not alarming. They were familiar, expected, and largely ignored. Many experienced what later generations would call broken sleep. People woke naturally after a few hours, lay awake in darkness, thought, prayed, or spoke quietly to those beside them. Some rose briefly, tending fires or checking doors. Sleep returned gradually, without urgency. Night was long. There was no reason to rush through it. Dreams were vivid and often remembered. Without constant stimulation during the day, the mind carried unresolved thoughts into the night. Worries replayed, memories surfaced. Fear, too, had room to grow in darkness. Nightmares were not uncommon, but they were rarely discussed. Fear was endured privately. Children slept lightly, stirred easily. Parents remained half awake, listening even in rest. Illness was a constant concern. A cough in the night, a fever, restless movement. These sounds mattered. Without artificial light, tending the sick required touch and instinct rather than sight. Privacy during sleep barely existed. Bodies shifted, breathed, coughed, murmured. Sleep was not silent. It was shared. Personal boundaries blurred. Yet this closeness was normal. People adapted to it early. Solitude was rare enough that it did not become an expectation. Night air was often cold and damp. Windows were closed tightly, sometimes too tightly. Rooms smelled of bodies, fabric, smoke, and the day's labor. Freshness was associated with morning, not night. Sleep occurred within these conditions, not apart from them. Time during the night was ambiguous. Without illuminated clocks, hours passed unmeasured. People knew roughly when dawn would arrive by instinct rather than calculation. The body tracked night more accurately than any device. As morning approached, sleep lightened again. Dreams faded. Awareness returned gradually. Some woke before light, lying still, conserving warmth. Others rose early, beginning the cycle again as soon as embers could be coaxed back into flame. Sleep before electricity was not optimized. It was not protected. It was woven imperfectly into a life shaped by labor, cold, and routine. Rest was sufficient, but rarely luxurious. Yet bodies adapted, minds adjusted. This rhythm persisted not because it was ideal, but because it was unavoidable. People did not romanticize their sleep. They accepted it. Night was something to pass through, quietly, patiently, until light returned and the world asked something of them again. Night before electricity was not a solid block of unconsciousness. It was a landscape people moved through slowly, drifting in and out of sleep without surprise. Darkness did not mean the mind switched off. Instead, it created space, long, uninterrupted space, where thought, memory, and sensation surfaced without resistance. After the first hours of sleep, waking was common. Eyes opened in darkness, not because something was wrong, but because the body had rested enough for the moment. There was no panic in this waking, no frustration. People lay still, listening, letting their thoughts settle into the quiet. Night belonged to this half-awake state as much as to sleep itself. In these moments, awareness sharpened. Without light, sound became precise. The smallest noise carried meaning. A distant footstep, fabric shifting, a breath-changing rhythm. People learned the language of night intimately. They knew which sounds belonged to the house, which to animals, and which required attention. Familiarity replaced fear. Many lay awake, thinking, not intentionally, but inevitably. The mind returned to unfinished conversations, worries about money, illness, weather, or work yet to come. Thoughts moved in slow circles, repeating without resolution. There was nothing to interrupt them, no distraction to escape into. Night demanded that one sit with the contents of the mind. Some prayed quietly, not ceremonially, but habitually. Prayer filled the silence where conversation had ended. Others simply waited, counting nothing, measuring nothing, allowing time to pass without marking it. Waiting was not uncomfortable. It was expected. For couples or families sharing beds, quiet exchanges sometimes occurred. Whispered words, brief reassurances, reminders of morning tasks. These conversations were short and practical. Darkness discouraged excess speech. Words mattered more when spoken. Occasionally, someone rose. Feet found the floor carefully, guided by memory rather than sight. The house was navigated slowly, hands brushing familiar surfaces. Fires were checked, doors tested. A child adjusted under blankets. These movements were unhurried, deliberate, and nearly silent. Season shaped the night deeply. Winter nights were long, heavy, and cold. Sleep was broken by discomfort as much as by thought. Bodies shifted repeatedly, seeking warmth. Breath condensed in the air. Morning felt distant. Summer nights, by contrast, were shorter but restless. Heat lingered. Insects moved audibly. Sleep came and went in shallow waves. Illness changed the night entirely. When someone was sick, sleep became alert rather than restorative. Caregivers rested lightly, waking at every sound. Without lamps burning continuously, tending illness required touch, closeness, and instinct. The night was filled with listening rather than sleeping. Children experienced night differently. Fear existed, but it was rarely indulged. Darkness was normal, not exceptional. Nightmares were endured quietly. Comfort came from presence rather than reassurance. A nearby body, a familiar sound, the knowledge that others were awake somewhere in the house. Time stretched during these hours. Without clocks glowing beside beds, the night felt endless. People did not know how long they had been awake, only that darkness still surrounded them. Eventually, sleep returned naturally, without effort. The body reclaimed rest when it was ready. This pattern often repeated more than once. Sleep, waking, thought, and sleep again. The night unfolded in sections, not as a single, uninterrupted state. This rhythm was so common that it required no explanation. It was simply how nights worked. As the deepest hours passed, the quality of darkness shifted. Silence changed. The air felt different. Some sensed morning before it arrived. Sleep lightened. Dreams became less vivid. Awareness crept back gently. People often woke before dawn, lying still, conserving warmth, listening for signs of the day. The first bird call, the faintest change in air, the suggestion of light beyond walls. These signals mattered. They marked the approaching return of responsibility. When rising early, movement was careful. The house was still wrapped in darkness. Fires were coaxed back to life quietly. Water was fetched silently. Morning preparation began before the world was visible. Sleep before electricity was deeply physical and deeply mental. It was shaped by fatigue, cold, sound, and thought. It offered rest, but not escape. Night did not erase worries. It gave them room. Yet people adapted. They did not expect sleep to be perfect. They did not measure it. They accepted its interruptions as normal, even necessary. The night was something to live through, not optimize. This long, layered experience of night shaped how people understood rest itself. Sleep was not separate from life. It was simply another phase of the same slow cycle: work, waiting, darkness, and light returning again. Before electricity, waking did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, often beginning long before the sky showed any sign of light. The body stirred first, not because it was fully rested, but because stillness had grown uncomfortable. Muscles shifted, breath deepened, awareness returned slowly, as if unsure whether it was worth waking yet. In the deepest hours before dawn, the world remained dark and quiet, but it was no longer asleep in the same way. Night had begun to loosen its hold. The silence felt different, thinner, less complete. People sensed this change instinctively. Even without seeing it, they knew morning was somewhere nearby, waiting. Many lay awake for long stretches, neither asleep nor fully alert. Thoughts returned gently, without urgency. The coming day was considered not with anxiety, but with familiarity. The same tasks would repeat. The same effort would be required. There was comfort in this predictability, even when life itself was difficult. When someone finally rose, it was done carefully. The house was navigated by memory. Floors were cold beneath bare or thinly covered feet. Hands reached automatically for walls, door frames, familiar objects. No light was used unless absolutely necessary. Darkness was still respected. Fires were the first concern. Without warmth, nothing else could proceed. Embers from the night before were coaxed gently, fed with care, encouraged rather than forced. This took time. Watching a flame return was a quiet ritual, repeated daily, rarely spoken about, yet deeply grounding. Water followed. It was lifted, poured, heated slowly. Every movement required effort. Nothing happened instantly. These early tasks were done mostly in silence. Speech felt unnecessary. The body was awake, but the mind lagged behind, moving cautiously into the day. Children were woken gradually, often reluctantly. There was no sharp separation between sleep and obligation. They dressed slowly, stiff from cold and restlessness. Complaints were brief and expected. Everyone understood that resistance would change nothing. Morning meals were simple and repetitive. There was little appetite before warmth fully returned to the body. Food was eaten for function, not pleasure. Steam from bowls or cups mattered more than flavor. Eating was another step toward readiness. Outside, the world began to reveal itself inch by inch. The sky lightened imperceptibly. Shapes emerged without detail. Sound returned before sight. Birds, distant movement, the suggestion of life restarting beyond walls. These signals guided timing more accurately than any clock. Fatigue lingered. Broken sleep left its mark. Minds felt dull, thoughts slower to form. Yet there was no concept of being unfit for the day. One worked regardless. Energy was something that appeared through movement, not before it. As light strengthened, confidence returned. Tasks became more precise. The body warmed. The mind sharpened slightly. What had felt heavy an hour earlier now felt manageable. Routine carried people forward when motivation did not. Morning before electricity was not hopeful in a dramatic sense. It did not promise improvement. It promised repetition. And within that repetition, stability existed. The day was known before it began. There were no surprises to brace for, only effort to be repeated. This beginning, repeated endlessly across years, shaped endurance. People learned to function without enthusiasm, without rest fully restored, without the illusion that tomorrow would be easier. They moved forward anyway. By the time the sun fully rose, the day had already begun in earnest. Work resumed. Time stretched out ahead once more, ready to be filled with labor, pauses, and silence. This cycle, broken sleep, slow waking, reluctant movement, and gradual readiness, defined life before electricity more than any single invention ever could. The body adapted, the mind adjusted, and day after day, people began again, not because they wanted to, but because the world expected it. Life before electricity did not announce change very often. Days followed one another quietly, with so little variation that memory itself began to blur. When people looked back on weeks or months, they did not recall individual days. They remembered patterns, the shape of work, the feel of fatigue, the slow turning of seasons. Time passed, but it left few clear marks. Morning resembled morning. Evening resembled evening. The body learned what was expected long before the mind engaged. Tasks were performed almost automatically. Hands moved through familiar motions while thoughts wandered elsewhere. This repetition was not boring in the modern sense. It was absorbing. Life required constant participation, leaving little room to step back and observe it. Without artificial light extending the day, the rhythm remained stable. Work expanded and contracted with the sun. People did not debate this arrangement. They adapted to it. Days felt long while they were being lived, but short when remembered. Fatigue made time feel heavy in the moment and light in memory. Years passed this way. People aged quietly. Changes were noticed, not suddenly, but gradually. Strength faded. Speed slowed. Endurance thinned. These shifts were accepted without much reflection. There was no culture of self-analysis. One simply adjusted and continued. Emotion settled into a steady state. Extreme highs were rare. Extreme lows were endured privately. Most days existed somewhere in between, shaped more by physical condition than mood. Happiness was quiet. Sadness was quieter. Both blended into routine. Waiting remained a defining experience. Waiting for letters, for harvests, for recovery from illness, for weather to change. Waiting without constant stimulation trained patience differently. The mind learned to circle the same thoughts repeatedly, wearing them smooth rather than resolving them. Memory behaved differently under these conditions. Without constant novelty, events flattened. Only disruptions stood out. Illness, death, travel, loss. Ordinary days merged into one long, continuous experience. People did not feel deprived by this. It was simply how life felt. Seasons provided the only clear markers of change. light lengthened and shortened. Cold arrived and retreated. Work adjusted slightly. Sleep shifted. These transitions mattered deeply. They reminded people that time was moving, even when days felt identical. A sense of endurance developed early. Life was not expected to entertain or fulfill. It was expected to be lived. Effort was normal. Rest was earned, but brief. Complaints were contained, not because people lacked feeling, but because expressing it changed nothing. Social life followed the same pattern. Relationships deepened slowly through proximity rather than conversation. People knew one another through shared routine, not confession. Silence together was common and comfortable. This repetition shaped identity. People defined themselves by what they did every day, not by aspirations. Occupation, family role, and endurance mattered more than personal desire. Life was practical before it was expressive. As years accumulated, individuals became part of the background of their own lives. They aged into routines so completely that change felt unnatural. Stability, even when hard, was preferred over disruption. This was the quiet weight of living before electricity. Not dramatic suffering, not constant joy, but persistence. Day after day, unfolding in near silence, until one day followed another, so closely that time itself seemed to soften and fade. And within this repetition, people lived entire lives, loved quietly, worried quietly, aged quietly, until repetition finally stopped. In old age, time behaved differently again. After decades of repetition, the pace that once felt endless began to contract. Days grew shorter, not because the sun moved faster, but because the body could no longer fill them in the same way. Energy faded earlier, movement slowed. Tasks that once defined the day became optional, then difficult, then impossible. Sleep changed once more. Night returned more often, arriving earlier, staying longer. The body sought rest not as recovery, but as relief. Wakefulness felt heavier now, more demanding. Lying still became easier than rising. Sleep was lighter, fractured, drifting in and out without structure. Older people woke frequently, not with purpose, but with discomfort. Joints ached, breath felt shallow. The familiar darkness no longer felt neutral. It carried memory. Silence invited reflection, whether it was wanted or not. Thoughts returned unprompted, replaying moments long past. The future stopped expanding. Attention turned backward naturally. Memories surfaced unevenly. Some days were recalled with clarity, others not at all. Time no longer formed a straight line. Past and present overlapped quietly in the mind, blending into one continuous awareness. Work receded from life gradually, first fewer hours, then lighter tasks, then observation replaced participation. Sitting became more common than standing. Watching replaced doing. This withdrawal was not announced. It simply happened, accepted without ceremony. The household adjusted around aging bodies. Younger members moved more quietly. Tasks were redistributed. Advice was offered less, listened to less. Authority softened. Presence mattered more than instruction. The elderly existed within the home as witnesses rather than drivers of daily life. Sleep extended into daylight. Naps were no longer indulgences, but necessities. The boundary between day and night blurred again, much like childhood. Rest returned to being something instinctive rather than scheduled. Illness lingered longer now. recovery slowed. A minor cold became weeks of weakness. Appetite faded gradually. Eating turned mechanical. Taste dulled. Warmth mattered more than nourishment. Conversation thinned. Speech required effort. Silence returned as the dominant state. This silence was not empty. It was filled with breath, movement, memory, and waiting. Waiting without expectation. The world continued its routines without pause. Seasons still turned. Work still resumed each morning. But for those nearing the end, participation narrowed. Life became smaller, quieter, closer to the body. Sleep grew deeper toward the end, but also stranger. Dreams blended with waking. Names were forgotten. Faces returned from earlier decades. Time lost its order. The mind drifted freely, no longer anchored to routine. Death did not arrive suddenly for most. It approached slowly through diminishing appetite, longer sleep, less awareness. The body let go incrementally, one responsibility at a time, one sensation at a time. There was no dramatic final night, just another evening that felt heavier than usual, another rest that lasted longer, another silence that stretched on. This was how life before electricity often ended, quietly, at home, surrounded by familiarity, without interruption. The same darkness that had shaped childhood, work, sleep, and age finally closed in completely. And the rhythm that had governed decades, light and dark, work and rest, waking and waiting, ended not with noise, but with stillness. After death, life did not stop immediately for those left behind. The house remained standing. The rooms held their shape. Objects stayed where they had always been. For a time, routine continued, almost unchanged, as if habit itself resisted the idea that someone was truly gone. Mornings still arrived the same way. Light entered the same windows. Fires were lit in the same hearths. Water was warmed, food prepared, floors crossed along familiar paths. Only one presence was missing, and that absence took time to fully register. Belongings remained untouched at first. Clothing stayed folded. Tools rested where they had last been placed. Beds were left unmade longer than usual. There was no urgency to clear or rearrange. Removing objects felt like erasing proof that someone had existed at all. Sleep inside the house changed subtly. Night felt quieter, but not peaceful. Familiar sounds were absent, breathing, shifting, coughing, replaced by a silence that felt unfinished. Those who remained slept lightly, listening for noises that would no longer come. Time behaved strangely during this period. Days felt suspended, neither normal nor fully altered. Routine carried people forward, while emotion lagged behind. Grief did not arrive dramatically. It settled slowly, filling small gaps left by habit. The body adjusted before the mind did. People rose at the same hours, prepared the same meals, followed the same movements. Only later did awareness catch up, noticing the extra space at the table, the unused chair, the unclaimed blanket. Homes before electricity absorbed absence deeply. Without constant noise or distraction, emptiness became noticeable. Rooms felt larger. Night felt longer. Silence had weight. The dead were rarely spoken of immediately, not out of avoidance, but because words felt inadequate. Memory lived quietly in shared routine rather than conversation. Stories returned gradually, often triggered by repetition. A task once shared, a habit once guided. Work continued because it had to. Fields still needed tending. Fires still required attention. Life demanded participation, even when energy was thin. This persistence did not diminish loss. It existed alongside it. As weeks passed, objects slowly changed status. What was once everyday became symbolic. A coat became memory. A tool became reminder. Decisions about these items were delayed as long as possible. Sleep slowly returned to a different rhythm. Exhaustion from grief layered itself onto physical fatigue. Rest came heavier, but less refreshing. Dreams became crowded with familiar faces, old voices, half-remembered moments. Night before electricity gave grief space. Darkness allowed memory to surface without interruption. Silence offered no escape. People lay awake longer, thinking without resolution. Over time, routine reshaped itself again. Tasks were redistributed. Spaces were repurposed. Absence was absorbed into the structure of daily life. The house learned who remained. Seasons continued their slow turning. Cold returned. Light shortened. Work adjusted accordingly. The world did not pause for grief, but neither did it erase it. Children adapted quickly, accepting change with less resistance. Adults carried memory longer. Elderly lingered between past and present, holding onto routines that no longer fully fit. Eventually, life resumed its familiar repetition, altered but stable. Another cycle took hold. Another generation moved forward. The rhythm persisted. This was how life before electricity handled endings, not with finality, but with continuation. Death removed a body, not a structure. Routine survived loss because it had always existed beyond individuals. And so the day ended again. Light faded, fires dimmed, the house settled. Sleep returned, imperfect and necessary, carrying memory quietly into the dark. Life before electricity did not seek meaning in endings. It simply continued until it could not. And then, just as quietly, it stopped.